A night wind droned through the wire, dry, rhythmic, and impersonal, until a living sound cut through it. Somewhere beyond the floodlit perimeter, an owl called, a single note that rose and fell like a breath. The German corporal on the top bunk, a farm boy from Hesse who knew every bird on his father's land by ear, stopped fidgeting with the rough army blanket and listened the way a thirsty man drinks. The barracks was full of the paper-dry smells of pine boards and laundry soap. Dust tickled his throat. Someone coughed. Then again, the owl, insistent now, a small, wild signature in a world of rules and schedules. He would only see the owl itself weeks later, skimming the palmettos beyond the back fence at first light. By then, he had a rhythm. Reveille, chow, line up, trucks for day labor. The shock of American abundance and its own kind of order. It took longer to notice the smaller rhythms, the ones that didn't make noise. The kid from Kansas who tucked bread crusts in his pocket for sparrows after mess. The older sergeant who whistled softly and left a saucer of water behind the latrine for a stray brindled dog that had started slinking along the fence line. These were unmilitary gestures, useless from the standpoint of production, and they were irresistible. The camp was more city than compound. Streets and blocks, laundry flapping against a white sun, a water tower like a watchful metal mushroom. It existed because of arithmetic, because ships that disgorged American soldiers in North Africa and Europe came back loaded with prisoners, and because the United States, with land and rails and food to spare, could hold them safely. There were hundreds of camps like it. By mid-war, hundreds of thousands of German POWs were scattered across the interior, near the farms and canneries and sawmills they kept running while American men were overseas. That number is cold on a page. In the seasonless light of a barracks, it means bunk after bunk of men learning that captivity has its own kinds of work and its own kinds of waiting. Waiting breeds habits. Habits, in a place where you own nothing, become a form of self. The guards noticed early that idle men get into trouble. The Geneva rules, the Red Cross visitors, and common sense all pushed in the same direction. Keep hands busy, minds occupied, routines predictable. Workshops appeared. Theater stages rose out of scrap timber. Soccer pitches were measured, rolled, and worn smooth by running feet. In some camps, fountains and miniature castles sprouted from poured concrete and scavenged brick, a stubborn expression of making in a world designed to reduce you to a number. In that same quiet, persistent way, animals slipped into the picture, not as military dogs with paperwork and ranks, but as something softer and stranger, as neighbors. The first animals were the least controversial, songbirds mostly. The corporal from Hesse noticed them because he wanted to, because their tiny bodies made a sound that cut through the machinery of the day. A POW with carpenter's hands and a calm face knocked together a seed tray from a crate. Someone else traded a packet of sugar for a handful of millet from the cookhouse. The birds came. They landed, hopped, learned the map of the yard. Men leaned on the sill and watched without speaking. The unspeakable had a way of filling your mouth. The last rifle volley you'd fired. The field dressing you'd tightened until your fingers went numb. The letter you hadn't received. Watching something alive be itself for 5 minutes became, unexpectedly, work the men wanted to do. Soon there were bigger creatures. Dogs first, because dogs learned the fence lines and figured out where the lunch scraps were dumped. A tan mutt with a Roman nose took to sleeping in the shade of the ration shed. A black and white collie visited a barracks door each evening, as if making rounds. Sometimes it was official. Some camps had working K9s on the perimeter. But more often it was simply opportunistic kindness, a series of small permissions that added up to a presence. A bowl of water, a patch of shade on an August noon, a guard pretending not to see a hand extended under the lower wire with something to eat cupped inside it. The word zoo was not spoken in those early days, and yet the logic of a zoo, gather, feed, watch, learn, was already there in miniature, improvised out of boredom and tenderness. If you had visited North America's wartime camps with a notebook, you would have found the most elaborate animal enclosures north of the border, where German prisoners in Canada built real lager zoos, complete with cages and pens for adopted local wildlife. Photographs from Camp 20 at Gravenhurst show neat timbered enclosures and men beaming as a raccoon clambers up a perch. It started there for very practical reasons. Canadian camps often sat near lakes and woods that teemed with unfamiliar animals. The prisoners were skilled, bored, and deeply curious. They trapped, rescued, and fed, and then they built. Word travels fast among men who spend their days waiting. A man transferred from Ontario to the American Midwest would talk about his camp's zoo as if describing a technical marvel, because in a sense it was. It was a place where rules bent around care. South of the border, the contour was similar, though the paper trail is thinner and the language less formal. In U.S. camps, the rules were written for rations, work details, and mail, not for mourning doves and strays. Still, the same ingredients were present. Huge, well-run compounds that provided food and time enough for hobbies. Commanders who preferred occupied prisoners to idle ones. Men who had grown up with animals and reached for what they knew when the future went blank. In Texas, a visitor today can still walk a POW site and see the foundations of a theater and the footprint of a garden fountain. Proof of how far prisoners could go with scrap and ingenuity. Contemporary accounts and local museum collections suggest the same hands sometimes built hutches or bird cages, improvised aviaries that sat in a sunny corner of a yard where nobody said no. The zoo, when the word was used at all, was a nickname, a wink, a way of describing a cluster of small mercies. The corporal from Hesse would have called it something else. He would have called it home, in the way soldiers use the word to describe any place where routine holds. Each morning, before the work trucks rattled past the gate, he slipped outside to leave crumbs on the tray. The barracks learned the shapes of the regulars, the red-shouldered blackbird that scolded everyone, the sparrow that bullied birds twice its size, the brave little wren with no tail christened General by a wit from Cologne because he strutted when he walked. Even the guards had favorites. The men learned to describe the birds to each other with a precision that suggested a deeper hunger for naming, for claiming something that could not be taken away. Numbers were always the backdrop. In the United States alone, hundreds of thousands of German POWs lived behind American wire at the war's peak, scattered from Alabama to Washington State in a network of base and branch camps. They came to fill a labor gap. They stayed because the ocean made escape fantasy. That scale can flatten the human texture of the story. The animals sharpen it again. A single dog sleeping through a hot afternoon in the shade of a barracks stairwell. A single mockingbird gurgling on the ridgepole at dusk. A single raccoon learning, with inscrutable calm, that a pair of hands will bring food at the same time each day. The tiny plots inside the larger plot, care, attention, and repetition, made sense to men whose lives had been reduced to schedules and numbers. Before long, the care itself became culture, A prisoner who had been a house painter in Bremen mixed a wash from laundry bluing and soot and painted a sign on a scrap of board. Tiergarten, 2 letters backward because the brush was too fat and he was laughing. The sign was a joke and a claim at once. In a corner of a Texas or Kansas camp where the afternoon light was good, a line of simple cages appeared, each big enough for a handful of birds or a rabbit. There were rules, quiet ones. No animals in the barracks. Food that did not come out of a guard's own mess. No teasing, no rough housing, no cruelty. The rules were not posted. They were enforced by the faces of men who, for a few minutes a day, were caretakers and not captives. The Americans noticed, of course. Some guards disapproved, and said so in the effortless authority of men in charge of gates. Others saw what was happening and adopted a policy of strategic blindness. A supply sergeant who had grown up on a farm in Iowa smuggled in a few lengths of poultry wire and a handful of bent nails, and told the men to use them careful. A corporal in the MP detachment, new to the camp and painfully homesick, lingered at the end of his shift to watch the birds feed, because watching something small eat without fear did something unaccountable in his chest. On Sundays, when the camp's band rehearsed for an hour after church call, the music floated across the yard, and the zoo seemed, for once, like a place that had been planned, an amenity rather than a smuggled hope. Mail told the truth most plainly. Prisoners were allowed to write home under strict rules, so many letters, so many postcards, and what they chose to describe said as much as the numbers in any head count. The censors cut out units and dates. They let birds and dogs pass. In a letter kept in a small-town museum today, a former prisoner writes about the little garden and the 2 doves we feed, and you can hear relief beating under his pencil marks like a second heart. In another set of letters, rescued from a cereal box in a Tennessee attic, you can hear neighbors and prisoners learning how to describe one another in ordinary human terms. When a man says, "The guard's dog knows me now," he is talking about more than a dog. He is talking about what captivity failed to kill. From a filmmaker's point of view, the strangeness here isn't spectacle, it's scale. You don't need a lion behind bars to make the frame astonishing. You need a hand passing a crust under a fence. You need a guard turning away for 10 seconds longer than the rulebook allows. You need the corporal watching a wren decide whether to trust him, and the exact moment the bird does. In North America's wartime camps, animals became the safe subject that allowed 2 worlds to talk to each other without speaking directly about guilt, loss, or fear. If Canadian camps made that conversation literal, with enclosures and signs, the American camps kept it intimate, improvised, and half hidden, the way real kindness often is. By the time the corporal from Hesse saw the owl, it ghosted along the fence line at dawn, pale and huge and silent. The Tiergarten had become routine. He would feed the birds before chow and check the water dish before roll call. He would wave at the collie when it made rounds. He would talk softly, not to the animals, but to the men who came to watch. And in that talk, the war bent, just a fraction, into something else. He would still wake with a start some nights, heart pounding, palms sweating, with the taste of North African dust in his mouth and the remembered clamor of a firefight in his ears. Then, morning would come, and a wren would land on the tray, because the world, however damaged, still contained wrens, and because he had made a place for it. He did not ask permission to love that fact. He held it in his hands the way he held the seed tin, careful and ordinary and essential. He would carry it home after the wire came down, and when he was an old man and someone asked him, eyes narrowed with suspicion, whether the Americans were cruel, he would say they were like this. He would say that a man in a brown uniform once stood quietly at the edge of a yard and did not speak while a tiny bird decided to eat in peace. The seed of the idea did not sprout in the United States at all. It began further north, in the Canadian wilderness, where German POWs faced long winters, dense forests, and a monotony that weighed even heavier than the barbed wire. In Camp 20 at Gravenhurst, Ontario, photographs survive showing prisoners crouched beside rough wooden cages, smiling as a raccoon peers through slats or a porcupine nibbles at a piece of bread. Canadian guards called it the Lager Zoo, and in time, the prisoners themselves used the same phrase with a mixture of pride and irony. The origin was simple: boredom and skill colliding with the environment. German soldiers, many of whom came from rural towns and farming families, recognized local wildlife not as pests, but as companions. They trapped, rescued, and nursed animals the way they once had at home. A fox kit abandoned near the fence became a camp celebrity. Squirrels, owls, and raccoons were caught, fed, and displayed. With timber from construction details and nails scavenged from crates, the prisoners built neat pens and aviaries. The zoo soon became a fixture, not just tolerated, but quietly encouraged by the camp's commandant, who saw in it both harmless entertainment and an effective way to reduce discipline problems. News traveled with the men. When prisoners were transferred south into the United States, whether to large base camps in Texas or smaller branch camps in the Midwest, they carried the memory with them. The stories of enclosures, of animals that could be fed and watched, filtered into the American system. Most U.S. camps did not reproduce the Canadian model in full. The regulations were stricter, the oversight tighter, and the local environment less forgiving. But the idea stuck. If Canada could have a lager zoo, why not a smaller version here? In the United States, what emerged was less formal, more improvised, but still recognizable. A rabbit pen in Kansas built from chicken wire. A line of bird cages in Texas nailed together from fruit crates. A stray dog in Alabama that became the camp mascot. Collar fashioned out of braided twine. The word zoo was sometimes used, sometimes not, but the spirit was the same. Taking animals, wild, stray, or domestic, and folding them into the rhythms of captivity. For the prisoners, it was more than pastime. Animals became symbolic. They represented innocence in a place where guilt and defeat hung heavy. They offered routine, feeding at dawn, cleaning cages at dusk, that paralleled farm life back home. They drew curious eyes from local civilians, especially children, who would peer through fences to glimpse the strange menagerie. And they provided something deeper, a reminder that even inside barbed wire, life could be nurtured, not just endured. For the Americans, the practice was tolerated so long as it caused no problems. Officers reasoned that a man busy building a cage was less likely to think about tunneling under one. Guards found themselves amused, even moved, by the sight of tough soldiers cooing over a rabbit or teaching a parakeet to mimic a tune. It was, as one sergeant put it, the strangest discipline tool we never asked for. Thus, the idea of a lager zoo born in Canada slipped into the U.S. system, not as formal policy but as scattered improvisations. A fox here, a cage of doves there, a dog sleeping beneath a mess hall bench. Tiny acts of caretaking, multiplied across hundreds of camps, became part of the texture of POW life in America. The United States never intended to have zoos inside its prisoner of war camps. What it did intend was order, strict adherence to the Geneva Convention of 1929, careful monitoring by the Red Cross, and the maintenance of discipline across a sprawling system that held nearly 500,000 German and Italian soldiers. Within that framework, strange things sometimes bloomed, not because they were written in any manual, but because commanders learned that a little leniency often bought them a lot of peace. The Geneva Convention promised POWs humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and freedom from unnecessary humiliation. It also allowed for recreation, libraries, music, sports, even gardening. Nowhere did it mention fox pens or aviaries, but the logic was the same. If prisoners were permitted to play soccer or stage a play, why not also care for a handful of animals, so long as it did not interfere with security or health? The Red Cross was a constant presence. Inspectors walked through camps, noted sanitation standards, examined kitchens, and read prisoner complaints. They could be sticklers about cleanliness. One camp report mentioned that a commander was warned about unhygienic conditions near a rabbit hutch. Another insisted that dogs wandering freely be tethered or confined. But rarely did inspectors demand that animals be removed outright. The small menageries, when they existed, were usually judged harmless. Local commandants had wide discretion. Some were strict, forbidding even pets for fear of fleas, rabies, or wasted rations. Others saw value in what they called morale activities. A Kansas camp commander remarked that prisoners who tended doves caused fewer problems than those left idle. In Texas, a colonel allowed bird cages to remain so long as they were kept neat and clean. In Alabama, guards looked the other way when POWs built a pen for goats, noting that the animals kept the grass trimmed around the barracks. For the prisoners, these spaces of permission were precious. They represented a kind of negotiated freedom. Building a cage, feeding an animal, or simply watching a sparrow land on a perch was an act of control in a life otherwise stripped of choices. When commanders allowed it, the message was clear. Discipline did not have to mean deprivation. Yet there were limits. Animals could not be housed in barracks, where they might spread lice or disease. They could not be fed from official rations, at least not openly. Guards sometimes confiscated scraps when they thought food was being diverted. And when animals posed a hazard, rabid skunks, venomous snakes, the rule was firm. They had to go. A Nebraska camp closed down an entire mini-zoo after 2 raccoons bit prisoners who had tried to tame them. Still, the boundaries were elastic. What mattered most was whether the animals served or disrupted the camp's invisible economy of discipline. If a commander believed they kept prisoners calm, they stayed. If he believed they bred unrest, they vanished. In this way, the fate of each camp zoo reflected not just the written law, but the personality of the men in charge and the fragile balance between authority and indulgence. What emerges from these glimpses is a portrait of improvisation. The rules of war carved out space for recreation, but the men inside those camps filled that space with choices that surprised even themselves. The zoos were never official policy. They were tolerated exceptions, acts of humanity that slipped between regulations, reminders that in captivity, life finds cracks where it can grow. In the flat plains of Texas, where summer heat shimmered above the barracks' roofs, a group of prisoners scavenged boards from a dismantled crate. The guards thought they were building shelves for tools. By the weekend, a small pen stood near the laundry line, housing 2 jackrabbits captured in the fields during a work detail. The rabbits, ears tall and twitching, became instant favorites. Men dropped bits of carrot or lettuce from the camp kitchen into the pen. At night, lantern light glowed off their pale fur, and the prisoners gathered in silence, watching the animals nibble. For men who had once known battlefields littered with bodies, the sight of creatures at peace was its own kind of balm. Further north, in Kansas, the land itself seemed to conspire with the prisoners. Birds thronged the open fields, and one group of POWs began building cages from chicken wire and broom handles. Soon, they had a small aviary filled with sparrows, finches, and a lone pigeon they named General Eisenhower. Guards laughed at the name but didn't stop them. A lieutenant, making his rounds one evening, found himself listening to the chorus of birds, and admitted later that it was the most cheerful sound in the whole camp. In Alabama, near the pine forests, prisoners returning from work detail brought with them a strayed dog that had followed their truck. The guards let it pass. The men named it Freiheit, freedom, and fashioned a collar out of braided twine. It slept under a barracks stairwell by night and followed prisoners in columns by day, tail high as if it belonged. Local children, peering through the fence, came not to stare at prisoners, but to watch the dog. In a world where humans were defined by uniforms and categories, an animal blurred the line. Nebraska offered another variation. A group of men digging irrigation ditches discovered a pair of turtles and smuggled them back to camp. They built a shallow pool lined with rocks, filling it daily with buckets of water. The turtles became a camp mascot of sorts, their slow movements a constant contrast to the rigid schedule of captivity. When Red Cross inspectors visited, the men proudly displayed the turtles, explaining in halting English that they were camp citizens. The inspectors, amused, noted the detail in their reports as evidence of humane conditions. Sometimes the zoos became almost theatrical. At a camp in Georgia, prisoners built a tiny menagerie that included chickens, doves, and a goat borrowed from a nearby farm. They constructed signs for each enclosure, painting names in block letters, Der Hahn, die Ziege. On Sundays, the goat was paraded around the yard like a mascot, its horns decorated with scraps of ribbon. Guards shook their heads, but discipline in the camp improved noticeably in those weeks. What linked these scattered vignettes was not scale, but spirit. None of the camp zoos were large. They were fragile, improvised, vulnerable to a commander's mood or a guard's order. Yet they mattered. For the men who built them, they became small islands of normal life inside an abnormal world. For the guards who tolerated them, they were proof that prisoners who cared for animals were less likely to stir trouble. For the children who watched from outside the fences, they were glimpses of something both surreal and strangely comforting. Soldiers of the Reich tending rabbits and turtles as if they were back on their family farms. In each case, the zoo was more than cages. It was ritual, feedings in the morning, water refilled at noon, repairs to cages before dusk. The animal's presence shaped the prisoners' days, gave rhythm to captivity, and softened the edges of defeat. In places built for discipline and order, the camp zoos became living contradictions, chaotic, tender, utterly unnecessary, and yet indispensable to the men who built them. For every camp where animals were welcomed, there was another where rules came down hard. Commanders knew that anything outside regulation could spiral. A few rabbits might be harmless, but what if they spread disease? What if a dog bit a guard? What if prisoners started using cages as hiding places for contraband? The logic of discipline was relentless. Order must outweigh sentiment. Reports survive of small zoos dismantled overnight. In Nebraska, after 2 raccoons scratched men who tried to tame them, The commandant ordered every cage in the yard burned. Prisoners watched in silence as their handiwork went up in smoke, the animals released into the fields beyond. The lesson was clear. Compassion could not trump control. Sanitation was another battleground. The Red Cross was strict about cleanliness, and cages often drew their attention. Inspectors in Texas warned of unhygienic conditions when food scraps piled up near a rabbit hutch. In Alabama, chickens kept too close to the barracks led to outbreaks of lice. Guards used these incidents as proof that animals belonged outside the wire, not within it. For some commandants, it was easier to ban pets entirely than to risk a bad report. There were cultural clashes, too. Some American officers saw the camp zoos as childish or even suspicious. To them, men who built birdhouses should have been repairing barracks or working in the fields. One captain described the prisoners' menagerie as a distraction from their labor duty. He dismantled it without warning, returning men to work details with the cold remark, "You are here to work, not to play farmer." Not all opposition came from above. Fellow prisoners sometimes resented the attention animals received. In crowded camps where food was rationed carefully, seeing scraps given to rabbits or dogs caused friction. Men who had endured hunger on the front questioned why precious calories went to creatures rather than comrades. One diary entry from a camp in Kansas describes a fight that broke out after bread was smuggled to feed doves. "Bread is for men, not birds," a prisoner scrawled bitterly. And yet, even in failure, the zoos left their mark. The very fact that they were torn down proved how much they mattered. Men remembered the sting of seeing cages destroyed as keenly as the joy of building them. To some, it was evidence that kindness was fragile in captivity, tolerated only until it inconvenienced authority. To others, it was simply another reminder that the war followed them everywhere, even into the smallest corners of their lives. Still, the attempts kept returning. A ban in one camp did not stop a new pen from rising in another. The impulse was stubborn, to care, to nurture, to build. Commanders could burn cages and chase animals, but they could not erase the memory of what it meant to feed a creature with your own hands. That memory lingered in letters, diaries, and later memoirs, outliving the bans that tried to erase it. The fragility of the camp zoos was part of their meaning. They were never secure, never official, always vulnerable. And perhaps that is why they mattered so much. Because in a world built on iron rules, even a few days of kindness felt like rebellion. When the gates finally opened and prisoners began their long journeys back to Germany, the animals stayed behind. Few camps had official policies for what to do with them, so the endings were improvised, much like the zoos themselves. Some creatures were released into the fields. In Nebraska, the turtles were carried to a creek at the edge of camp, where men stood in silence as the animals slipped into the water. In Texas, rabbits were turned loose on a grassy slope. A prisoner later wrote that he watched them vanish into the tall grass and felt a strange envy because they were free first. Other animals passed into local hands. Dogs that had attached themselves to POW columns were adopted by guards or townspeople. One Alabama camp goat, famous for its ribbon-decorated horns, ended its days on a nearby farm, remembered by both Americans and Germans as the mascot of captivity. In Kansas, doves and pigeons were simply left to roost in barns around the camp, a living echo that lingered long after the men were gone. For the prisoners, departure was bittersweet. They carried home no souvenirs except memory. But those memories grew roots. In memoirs written decades later, animals reappeared again and again, small companions in a time of defeat. A former Wehrmacht corporal recalled in a 1970 interview that the sight of sparrows feeding in camp saved his sanity. Another remembered the camp dog that followed him everywhere. "I still dream of him," he admitted, "more often than of my comrades." The legacy lived not just in memories, but in culture. After the war, as jazz and swing spread across West Germany, so too did stories of captivity. Families gathered around dinner tables and heard fathers speak not of battles, but of birds, dogs, and goats. Museums that preserve POW history today often display letters or sketches of animals alongside uniforms and tools. Visitors are often surprised. They expect weapons and maps, not drawings of rabbits in neat little cages. The zoos also shaped how former prisoners described America. For many, the animals symbolized a humanity they had not expected. They told their children, sometimes with embarrassment, sometimes with pride, that the Americans let us keep pets. In a world rebuilding from ruins, those stories softened the image of the former enemy. Local communities remembered too. Farmers who had watched prisoners care for animals told their children about the strange sight. Enemy soldiers building birdhouses. In small-town papers of the 1950s and 60s, the anecdotes surfaced whenever reunions were held. They became part of local folklore, a reminder that even in war, odd pockets of peace had existed. By the time the camps themselves were dismantled, barracks sold off, fences cut down, land returned to farmers, the animals had long gone. But the memory of the zoos lingered in diaries, in letters tucked into family trunks, in oral histories told late at night. They were fragile, like the cages themselves, but they endured. The zoos had been temporary, improvised, forgotten by official histories, yet they remained etched in the lives of those who built them, living proof that even in captivity, men had reached instinctively for life, not destruction. On the surface, the zoos seemed trivial. Cages of rabbits, a stray dog with a collar of twine, a pigeon christened with a joke name. But beneath the smallness lay something vast. They revealed that even in captivity, men fought not only to survive, but to create, to feed, to nurture, to build order in chaos. The zoos were not about animals alone. They were about reclaiming humanity in a place designed to strip it away. In every war, armies tried to control the image of the enemy. Germans had been taught that Americans were crude, violent, without culture. Americans had been told that Germans were ruthless, machine-like, incapable of gentleness. The zoos subverted both images. To see prisoners bent carefully over a bird cage was to witness something that no propaganda leaflet could have prepared anyone for. To hear an American guard chuckle as a goat trotted around with ribbons tied to its horns was to recognize that laughter could exist even between captor and captive. The zoos also embodied resistance of a peculiar kind. Not resistance with tunnels and weapons, but resistance through care. In a world dominated by commands and schedules, a man choosing to feed a sparrow was asserting a small freedom. He was saying, "I can still give rather than take. I can still shape life rather than destroy it." That choice, repeated daily, became a quiet rebellion against the logic of war. Psychologists who later studied POW life noted that hobbies, routines, and acts of creation helped men preserve mental stability. The zoos were an extreme example of that principle. They gave prisoners something outside themselves to focus on, something that demanded attention and consistency. A rabbit that went unfed would suffer. a bird without water would die. To keep them alive was to commit to responsibility, and responsibility gave meaning. For the Americans, the zoos became unintended propaganda. They demonstrated, without speeches or posters, that America was secure enough to allow even its enemies moments of humanity. A prisoner writing home about feeding doves undermined years of Nazi claims about Allied brutality. A visitor seeing a pen of rabbits inside a camp could not help but think, this is not a place of cruelty. The zoos, small as they were, became quiet ambassadors of American power and confidence. But their most enduring meaning may be even simpler. They remind us that the human instinct to care cannot be completely suppressed, even by war. Men who had been trained to fight, who had endured brutal campaigns, who had lost comrades in fire and blood, still found themselves building cages for birds. They still laughed at a goat's antics. They still poured time and energy into something utterly unnecessary for survival, yet essential for the soul. In that sense, the zoos were symbols of survival in the deepest sense, not just surviving as bodies, but surviving as humans. They showed that captivity did not erase the capacity for tenderness, that war could not obliterate the desire to create life instead of destroy it. And in their absurdity, enemy soldiers building petting zoos behind barbed wire, they revealed the contradictions of war itself. Today, the fences are gone. The guard towers have been dismantled. On many sites where POW camps once stood, there are wheat fields, subdivisions, or quiet groves of trees. Visitors who walk these places see only traces. A concrete slab where a barracks stood, the faint outline of a foundation, a rusting water pipe sticking out of the ground. But if you pause, if you listen, you can almost imagine the echoes, the laughter of men at feeding time, the clatter of a wooden cage door, the soft cooing of doves that once fluttered in improvised aviaries. In Nebraska, local museums preserve fragments, a prisoner's sketch of a turtle pond, letters mentioning rabbits, even a photograph of a stray dog surrounded by grinning men in uniforms without insignia. In Texas, concrete ornaments made by POWs survive, evidence of the creativity that also built small animal pens. In Alabama, oral histories recall the camp goat that children from nearby farms would come to see. These memories, scattered and fragile, form a mosaic of a world almost forgotten. Standing on such ground, it is tempting to ask, why does this matter? Why remember rabbits and pigeons when the war was so vast, so violent? The answer lies in what these zoos reveal about human nature. They are reminders that even in war, men reach for normality, for care, for a connection to life outside destruction. They show us that captivity was not just about waiting for release, but about building small worlds of meaning inside the wire. The zoos also remind us of the strange, often contradictory character of history. Soldiers who had marched under the swastika, who had fought against American boys on distant fields, ended up building birdhouses and tending goats under American guard. Guards who had faced the brutality of combat allowed these same men to build tiny sanctuaries. It is a story that complicates simple narratives of friend and enemy, cruelty and kindness. Most of all, the zoos tell us that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but in gestures, in the choice to feed, to protect, to create. They are proof that even in places designed to contain and control, humanity can improvise, and sometimes it improvises tenderness. The animals are long gone. The pens have rotted away, but the memory endures in letters, diaries, photographs, and in the descendants of those who once lived behind the wire. It endures in the quiet surprise of anyone who hears the story for the first time, that German POWs in America built zoos. Small, fragile, fleeting zoos, but zoos nonetheless. And perhaps that surprise is the lesson. War will always leave ruins. But in those ruins, men sometimes build unlikely things, things that make no sense strategically, yet make all the sense in the world as acts of survival. That is why these forgotten zoos matter, because they remind us that even in the hardest of times, the human spirit still reaches for life.